So you want to own a nuclear power plant. Reliable baseload electricity around the clock, a 60-plus year operating life once it's running, and right now, in 2026, a genuine demand revival driven by AI data centers desperate for the kind of steady power a solar farm simply can't guarantee at 3 in the morning. It looks like one of the most durable infrastructure assets a person or a utility could possibly own. Here's the number that should stop you before you get too excited about that demand story. A global study of nuclear construction projects found that 97% of them finish over budget by an average of $1.3 billion. The most recent example in the United States proves the point spectacularly. Plant Vogtle in Georgia was approved in 2012 with a $14 billion budget for 2 new reactors. It finished 6 to 8 years late at a total cost between $34 and $37 billion, making it the most expensive power plant ever built on planet Earth. And here's the second number that matters just as much. The entire U.S. nuclear industry's legal liability for a single catastrophic accident is capped by federal law at $16.6 billion, a fraction of what the Fukushima disaster alone has already cost, estimated at well over $150 billion and still climbing more than a decade later. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually costs to build a nuclear plant today, why the construction phase alone can make or break the entire investment before a single watt is generated, the unusual financing mechanism that lets ordinary electricity customers start paying for a plant years before it turns on, and the federal law that quietly determines who actually bears the risk if something goes catastrophically wrong. Owning a nuclear power plant isn't one business. It's 3, all splitting the same atoms. Version 1. The traditional regulated utility plant, built and owned by a regulated electric utility, with construction and operating costs passed through to a captive customer base under a state public service commission's oversight, the model behind almost every large reactor built in the United States. Version 2. The merchant, or deregulated plant, operating in a competitive wholesale electricity market rather than under a guaranteed regulated rate of return, exposed directly to swings in the market price of power rather than a captive ratepayer base absorbing cost overruns automatically. Version 3, the emerging small modular reactor, or SMR, a newer, theoretically faster-to-build category of smaller reactors, increasingly financed through direct power purchase agreements with large corporate buyers, particularly technology companies seeking dedicated, reliable power for data centers, rather than through the traditional regulated utility model at all. On paper, nuclear construction costs look almost achievable. A 2022 MIT study projected an overnight capital cost of around $2,900 per kilowatt for a modern AP1000 design, which would put a 1.4 gigawatt plant at roughly $4 to $4.6 billion, assuming a standardized design, an experienced contractor, low-interest financing, and genuinely no delays. That assumption almost never survives contact with reality. Plant Vogel's 2 AP1000 reactors, the only nuclear units under construction in the United States this decade, ended up costing somewhere around $15 per watt of capacity, roughly 3 times the streamlined target, pushed there by mid-construction design changes, the bankruptcy of the reactor's original contractor, Westinghouse Electric, and years of schedule slippage. The gap between the optimistic engineering estimate and the real-world track record isn't a rounding error. It's routinely the entire difference between a reasonable infrastructure investment and one of the most expensive mistakes in the history of American utility construction. Here's the part of this business that explains why cost overruns keep happening project after project. In a traditional regulated utility structure, the company doesn't just recover its construction cost from customers. It earns a guaranteed rate of return on those costs, meaning a larger capital base, even one inflated by delays and mismanagement, can translate directly into higher utility profits, not just higher customer bills. That dynamic played out almost exactly as written at Plant Vogtle. According to an analysis from Georgia consumer and environmental groups, Georgia Power pocketed roughly $17 billion in profits during the very same period. It racked up $18 billion in cost overruns on the project. The state's Public Service Commission, responsible for protecting ratepayers, allowed it. Georgia is also one of only a handful of states without an independent consumer utility advocate empowered to challenge a utility's cost claims in these billion-dollar rate cases. The incentive to control costs, the thing that would normally discipline an ordinary business, was structurally weaker than the incentive to simply let the meter keep running. Now for the mechanism that determines who actually pays for all of this, and it's not primarily the utility's own shareholders. Many states allow a financing tool called construction work in progress, which lets a utility begin charging customers for a plant's construction costs years before that plant ever generates a single watt of electricity. Georgia Power customers paid roughly $1,000 per household in these early pre-completion tariffs between 2011 and 2024, while Vogtle's third and fourth reactors were still years away from producing power. Then, once the plant actually came online, customers were hit again. Georgia saw the largest residential electricity rate increase in state history once Vogtle's new units entered commercial service, a rise of nearly 24%. In other words, the same customers who'd already been paying toward a plant that wasn't generating anything yet were the same customers who absorbed the bulk of the cost once it finally was. The financial risk of a multi-billion-dollar construction overrun, the risk that would sink an ordinary private company, gets substantially transferred onto a captive customer base that never had a say in the original budget. Here's the part of this industry almost nobody who flips on a light switch has ever thought about. Since 1957, a federal law called the Price-Anderson Act has capped the entire U.S. nuclear industry's total legal liability for a single catastrophic accident. As of the most recent inflation adjustment, that cap sits at $16.6 billion, funded through a combination of primary insurance at each individual plant site and a pooled fund built from retrospective premiums that every one of the roughly 95 covered U.S. reactors would be required to pay into if a serious accident occurred anywhere in the country. Because this federal framework exists, ordinary property and liability insurance policies in the United States explicitly exclude nuclear accidents entirely. No private insurer will touch that risk on its own. The entire industry's ability to operate depends on this single piece of legislation, recently extended by Congress out to the year 2065, and the scale mismatch is genuinely enormous. Damage and cleanup costs from the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in Japan have already surpassed $150 billion, nearly 10 times the entire U.S. industry's total liability cap, and the cleanup there is still ongoing more than a decade later. If a comparable accident happened at a U.S. plant, the $16.6 billion industry-funded pool would be exhausted almost immediately, and any further compensation would require Congress to separately appropriate additional taxpayer funds, with no automatic mechanism guaranteeing it would. Nuclear power is experiencing a genuine resurgence in interest, driven substantially by data center operators seeking reliable, round-the-clock power for AI computing that intermittent renewable sources can't fully guarantee on their own. Small modular reactor projects are proliferating, and several states are expanding their nuclear ambitions considerably. But the underlying construction track record hasn't materially improved. That 97% budget overrun statistic reflects decades of global nuclear projects, and Vogtle remains, as of this recording, the only large reactor project completed in the United States in this entire modern era, a cautionary tale sitting directly alongside the industry's renewed enthusiasm. Scenario 1. A nuclear project moves forward in a state with genuine independent ratepayer advocacy, firm contractual cost-sharing arrangements that put real financial risk on the contractor, and utility rather than passing overruns automatically to customers, and a standardized design built without mid-construction changes. Construction stays reasonably close to its original budget. And once operating, the plant delivers exactly what nuclear power is supposed to: deliver 60-plus years of low fuel cost, high capacity factor baseload electricity, a genuinely strong long-term infrastructure asset once the hardest, riskiest phase is behind it. Scenario 2. A project unfolds the way Plant Vogtle did. An unproven design combined with an inexperienced contractor, mid-construction changes, a contractor bankruptcy partway through, and a regulatory environment where the utilities' profits actually grow alongside the overruns rather than being penalized by them. Construction work in progress charges start hitting customer bills years before the plant produces any power at all, and completion brings the largest rate increase in the state's history. The plant may still eventually deliver reliable electricity for decades, but the true cost of getting there was paid almost entirely by ordinary electricity customers, with the company that built it emerging financially stronger, not weaker, for having gone $20 billion over budget. So the next time someone describes nuclear power as the obvious answer to reliable carbon-free electricity, the physics genuinely support that case. But the economics of actually building one of these plants has almost nothing to do with reactor design and almost everything to do with who bears the risk when the budget is wrong, which happens 9 times out of 10, and who's on the hook if the worst genuinely happens, which federal law has quietly decided isn't primarily the industry itself. The reactor was never really the product. The financing structure that lets a utility profit from its own delays, and the liability cap that keeps taxpayers as the ultimate backstop beyond a fraction of what a real accident could cost. That's the actual economics of owning a nuclear power plant.